Good afternoon. So it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Steve Griffitt's from the Khalifa University of Science and Technology in Dubai to give us a talk on prototyping future cities. As you know, this is a topic which has been widely discussed in various international and national audiences, and definitely it is a forward-looking and very challenging issue which will probably be on the agenda for the next decades, since the future is something running further. So after this talk, we will get engaged into a small discussion, a brief discussion between Professor Griffitsa and our colleague, Professor Vисенте Гуяартом, who is chairing a master program at the Higher School of Economics with exactly the same title, Prototyping Future Cities. And Vисенте was a chief architect in Barcelona for several years, and it has been very valuable for the Higher School of Economics to get his expertise into both educational programs and our research activities. So at the Higher School of Economics, we also have a wide range of research devoted to foresight at broad and to the future of cities in particular. So we used to have several projects with different clients on that matter. And of course, we all understand that the future of cities is an overarching agenda which involves a broad range of issues related to various fields of science, starting from demography to engineering, to energy, to environment, to ethnical issues. So there are really very many issues which actually refer to many departments and educational and research projects at the Higher School of Economics. I also hope that Professor Griffitt's will tell us a bit about the university itself, and we agreed that we will discuss the opportunities for collaborating between the Khalifa University and the Higher School of Economics, and also we may think of joint research and of exchanging students and teachers. So I guess we may have a wide agenda for cooperation as well. It is also important to stress that this lecture is given in the framework of our long-term collaboration with the Global Energy Award Association. It is one of the major international award programs for research and political activities in the field of energy, highly recognized, well established, so that also contributes to our networking with global energy. So please.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Moscow. I always enjoy coming here with Global Energy and giving lectures. And today, the topic of the lecture has been discussed, will be cities. And so in particular, we'll talk about prototyping smart and sustainable cities, which is an extremely important topic. Every time I think about the world and really cities taking up, or urban areas, which have many different definitions, but typically a few thousand people living and working together, these areas taking up such a small part of the land mass, maybe 2 to 3% of the global land mass, but having such a major impact on energy and climate and society. It's just a very, very, it gives me great enthusiasm to talk about where I see things headed. In particular, the context of where Khalifa University is, where I'm the Senior Vice President for Research and Development, very urban area in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, United Arab Emirates. Most of the countries, 85+% urbanized. So cities is an enormously important topic. I'll talk about that today. So what I'll do is I'll go through a little bit of background on cities, urbanization, some things you may know, some things you may not, to make sure everyone has the same context. Then get into some of the specifics about sustainability in cities and smart cities. what these definitions mean, how they come together, and then spend most of the time on prototyping. So what are we doing in the context of the United Arab Emirates, and particularly the major cities, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, in order to try and see what technologies, what ways of developing cities work well. So that will be, and then of course we'll follow with discussion. So that's the context of the talk today. So for those that may or may not be aware, the first, I think, just maybe turn it on. The first slide is to just give you the sense of where we are today with urbanization. And so urbanization, again, as I've mentioned, every country has its own definition, but we're talking about thousands of people typically living together, can be up to millions, tens of millions of people living together, working and engaging in life and society. So today, when you take that broad definition, about 55, 56% of the world is urbanized, and North America, South America, much of Europe is already approaching very high levels of urbanization, 60, 70% plus. It's simply Africa, some areas of Southeast Asia, which are heavily under-urbanized, but are quickly moving toward urbanization. So as we see going toward 2050, about 65, 70% of the global population will live in cities, in urban areas. And so those areas of Africa, which today are very rural, Asia, Southeast Asia, you'll see those populations becoming closer toward majority urban. And then, of course, North America, South America, Europe, what we see as Northeast Asia will be extraordinarily urbanized, similar to what we see already in the GCC countries, probably approaching 80, 90% cities. So if you look at the top of this picture, we know that now we're no longer agricultural society. We've gone toward urbanization in cities, but what comes with that? And so the challenge that we see is that cities, they consume 66%, about 2/3 of energy globally. That means they're producing, particularly when they're consuming fossil fuels, about 70% of the CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Tremendous amount of waste generation happening in cities. We're talking about very soon a couple billion, 2 billion tons of waste being generated, and the materials being consumed. This ongoing consumption to build cities and develop them as they grow rapidly is enormous. Talking about up to 90 billion tons of materials being consumed in cities by 2050. So it's in some ways very good to see cities evolving, because we know cities are the central point of economic activity, but also they come with their own challenges. And so we have to start thinking about how we move toward building cities in a way that will make them as productive and as, quote, sustainable as possible. And so I work a lot with the World Energy Council, and we have spent quite a bit of time thinking about what are the areas in which global energy leaders are looking at sustainability, or looking at the issues that will face the energy sector going forward, the most priority areas, the most pressing areas for immediate action, and those areas where the impacts are less certain. As we see here, there are today energy efficiency, renewable energy, of course, these are growing quickly in importance, and so those are areas for immediate action. But slightly in the upper right-hand quadrant, you'll see that there are areas that are highly important but more uncertain, and not quite as uncertain as U.S. policy, which, due to our leader in the United States, creates uncertainty on a daily basis. You have cities, and so cities are evolving toward an area of high impact, high importance, but they don't have a completely clear outcome for those people that are looking at this from the leadership perspective in the energy sector. And so the question is, why is that? On the sustainability front, what makes understanding the evolution of cities a challenge? And what makes it a challenge is cities are very complex systems. And so on the sustainability front, if you start looking at how a city could evolve to becoming more sustainable, there are multiple different fronts on which you have to take the consideration. One is the power sector, the other is the buildings, you have transportation, you have waste. Within these different areas, if you're trying to consider how you're going to become, quote, more sustainable, consume less energy, generate less waste, have more efficient forms of operation of buildings and transportation, you have many different ways in which you can go about doing this. Now, we know from the C40 Cities Initiative that buildings and power transformation can provide quite a bit of the potential greenhouse gas emissions that we're hoping to see as we're looking at global sustainability, which is trying to bring society to be able to live as well as possible without having a negative impact on the planet. However, you can't just focus on one technology or one area within power or buildings. You have to also consider transportation, how cities are built around transportation and also the waste sector. So in fact, there is no silver bullet, although there are areas that we can move. If we were to take the different components of power, buildings, transport, and waste and optimally implement, quote, sustainable technologies, you'll hear about several of those today, for instance, renewable energy, we could go very, very far toward trying to, or actually meeting the targets that has been set out several years ago in the Paris Agreement, which is the attempt to try and mitigate or reduce the impact on global temperature through greenhouse gas emissions to less than or not more than 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. So coming back to what I originally said, why cities are so important from the sustainability perspective, they are the major energy consumers, they are the major emitters of greenhouse gases. If we could optimally develop cities in all the contexts I'll talk about today, you essentially by 2030 could be well on the way toward having a fully sustainable planet, as you see here, and getting toward this rather ambitious reduction in what we call the business as usual greenhouse gas emissions, which to me is a very, very impressive opportunity. Just focusing on cities, which is a rather complex issue in its own right, would allow us to go very, very far toward, quote, sustainability. Now, in parallel to sustainability, there's the other area that we explore, and not always is it considered exactly in the same breath or discussion as sustainability, is smart cities. Because of the ongoing development of technologies, what they sometimes refer to as the fourth industrial revolution, there are now a tremendous amounts of technologies, and particularly data, being made available toward giving cities the ability to seem in their operation more intelligent. For instance, many of you may have heard about the next generation of wireless technology, 5G wireless, now being able to exchange extraordinarily large amounts of data, gigabytes being transferred wirelessly with millisecond delays, almost seamlessly, rapidly transmitting data around a city. Tremendous opportunity which will allow data to be collected from all different aspects of the city, all different sectors, buildings, transport, waste collection devices, power sector being monitored, and then bringing those data towards storage repositories which will make the data available ultimately toward increasingly sophisticated algorithms running on very sophisticated hardware. This is the rise of artificial intelligence, so that decision makers can make better decisions about how to manage cities, or increasingly, decisions can be done autonomously. And we can just have systems running as efficiently, as effectively as possible, given the algorithms that we programmed. And this is all happening in parallel to sustainability. It can support sustainability, but unless we're careful, a smart city doesn't necessarily become a sustainable city. And so that's why we talk about prototyping, at least from this discussion. I like to bring smart and sustainable into the same dialogue. To give you a sense of the data, and I think data is probably the number one area that is making the smart city paradigm possible. The explosion is it's just unparalleled, I think, in history as to how much data now gets generated. So this is actually getting even outdated as we speak. Talking about exabytes, I don't talk in quintillions, I talk more in exas and zetas and things like that. So on a daily basis, 2.5 exabytes of data being generated, which is now leading by the end of this decade toward having on an almost daily basis, essentially a daily basis, every second 1.7 megabytes of data being generated per person, leading to, if you've even thought about the term zeta before, up to 100 zettabytes of data annually being created globally. It's just such an enormous amount of information. If you look at what happens every minute of the day globally, I won't go through all these, but you can imagine every single minute, 4.5 million YouTube videos being watched, almost 4 million searches happening on Google, and then Uber. I know Uber is not in every single country. We're talking about cities, transportation, 1,400 rides being taken on just one of the many types of ride-hailing services happening. And every time you have a Google search, you have a YouTube video, or you have an Uber ride, you're creating data. You're generating data. It's data that has insights and data that can be actioned to help the businesses using the data do better, to help the cities that are using the data do better. So I think this data explosion is it's something that's going to continue and we have to deal with, and it really is at the heart of intelligence. So with the smart and sustainable paradigm, where do we typically see the opportunities? And I think, I'd say I call it the 10-30 rule. If you look across all the major areas in which personal well-being can be optimized, whether it's the environment, whether it's health, whether it's safety or security. When you go about implementing in an optimal way a smart city and try to make it a sustainable city, you can improve relative to business as usual by 10 to 30% in almost every area. There's very few areas that, as you can see here, McKinsey and many other consultancy companies have done these reports. Over and over and over again, you'll see the opportunity for 10 to 30% improvements. And so I've talked a lot about environment. We talk about the water, greenhouse gases, water and such, but you can't forget when we talk about cities, although what we do here in global energy and in my work, I focus a lot on energy. It's not just about waste, water, and energy and utility perspective, transportation, also related to energy, but you have the area of health, which is extraordinarily important, safety, security, and then all government services. And so this makes essentially the sustainable city. And so much in one system can be done. It's just a phenomenal opportunity. Now, I won't go through this in great detail, but we have done is we've thought about prototyping and where in the context I'll talk about a lot today, which is the Middle East, where we can do pilots, where we can do demonstrations to see how to make cities smart and sustainable. The list keeps growing and growing and growing. And this list was generated as we thought about utilities, as I mentioned, and mobility, and we looked at safety, security, public services, and health within the context of a new study that we're doing, or actually a new competition we're doing with a company in cybersecurity called Dark Matter. We just kept coming up with more and more ways in which a smart city can be improved upon through digital information. The reason it came up is a sort of aside in a conversation about a cybersecurity award is you imagine every time you do something digital and you try to improve the lives of people, now you have to make sure the data and the analysis of data is secure. And so is a running parallel thread to all this is the complications of smart cities, which is probably a lecture in its own right. But I'll just say on this particular slide, it was the focus is how do you pick prototypes to implement a city, which is really the focus of today. And so now that we're looking at this notion of prototypes, before I get into the context of the UE, something that's very, very important is a city is not just a city. The city has a context. In order to figure out what makes the most sense to make a smart, sustainable city in the Gulf region, you have to consider what are the different types of archetypes for cities or what different types of structures or paradigms you have in cities. And so one way to look at it, at the highest level, you can look at the wealth of cities. So I look at the wealth, the population density, the geography, which determines if you're consuming heating, cooling, of course, your energy sources. All of those factors determine how a city can be optimally looked at to make it smart and sustainable. In this paradigm, which was done by Shell, I think is as good as any, the underlying fabric of what defines city is in one dimension, at least, is wealth. So all the cities you see here have what we call, or what we say is low GDP per capita. They're not that wealthy. That doesn't mean they're all the same. Some of these cities, if you look at Marrakesh, for instance, in Morocco, it's relatively low population density, and it's not that wealthy. That's one paradigm for the way in which a city will operate. If you go to the Philippines, just looking at the picture and how things are packed together, and I hate to say it, but it's, the Manila and in some areas of Brazil, you see a lot of slums. And so people, they're in populated cities, they're not very wealthy cities, and they're packed together. That's another paradigm, and you have to develop a city in that context. Other cities, many in China, they're developing, they have high populations, but they're sprawling. So here, as you can imagine, you have to connect people with transportation. It's not always the best, and long distances in cities which are not that financially well off. And so that's one area. Now, I will point out, again, I can't go into all the interesting areas of cities. Transportation is one that I look a lot at. What you'll find in all of these cities, which are, I would say, somewhat the more challenging context, is the transportation sectors are not that well developed, and they're actually fairly poor. The transportation, I think, when we talk about cities as in a takeaway from the whole discussion, is one of the areas that really needs to be looked at in all cities. If you can take an analogy to the human body, no matter how good is your organs, your muscles, your brain, if your arteries don't work and the blood doesn't flow, you're not going to survive. And I think cities are growing up in this way. I live it every day, driving over here, even in Moscow, traffic and dealing with trying to get to a place that's not that far away, but taking 20 minutes. Cities have to deal with this. And so I think transportation is going to be an ongoing area that we're looking at in the Middle East and will be particularly important globally. Now, if we come to the next set of cities, those that are a little wealthier, I'll come back to transportation. I think it's a little better here, but still not that good. you have a whole different paradigm because now you have wealthier cities, and the wealthier cities have the same types of issues. So you can have a wealthy city, look at the US, look at a city like Los Angeles. It's wealthy, it's got large population, but it's sprawled out all over the place. So it's very long distances, people driving, using lots of cars. You come to what's probably considered the best mode of a city. Hong Kong, for instance, it's a wealthy, highly populated, extraordinarily dense, but still has challenges. But that starts to get you toward what we're looking at as being a sustainable city. People living together with wealth and in a way that doesn't make them have to drive or commute extraordinarily long distances, particularly with fossil fuel combusting vehicles to get place to place. What you're going to hear more about today is not an urban powerhouse. We're going to talk about the prosperous community, which is what we see in the Middle East quite frequently. Here you have very wealthy cities. Populations are not that high, and the population density is not that high. And so as I started to go from the idea of smart and sustainable toward what is the particular focus of my talk, it's important to say that this particular area that I'm talking about, the Middle East, is one context for cities. If you had a talk from someone from Hong Kong, they're probably going to tell you different things that are important to them. And so I think that paradigm and that comparability across cities has to always be within context. So that said, getting to the idea of prototyping, now we go toward what I do every day is thinking about the different sectors which impact smart and sustainable cities in the Middle East. So if you haven't been to the United Arab Emirates, it is a relatively small country, population about 10 million people in the Gulf Cooperation Council, so it borders on the Arabian Sea. Sometimes they call that the Persian Gulf. And in the UAE, we have really two big cities that we care about the most. They're also emirates. There are 7 emirates. It's sort of like a state concept, but they're called emirates. 7 of them, and 2 of the emirates also have cities with the same name. So Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Abu Dhabi being the capital. The cities, they're very wealthy. So you have some of the highest GDP per capita in the world in these cities. They're not that populated. It's a few million people per city, but when the whole country is 10 million, you can imagine a lot of the people are living, as I said, in cities. Urbanization is over 85%. And the density of the cities is not that great today. And so we have lots of people with cars. People drive everywhere. Drive your car 1 block to get anything. No one walks. There's not that much biking. It's being improved upon. It's a transportation upgrade, but it's this context of lots of people driving. So wealthy, modest population, and not that dense. So when we look at these cities, we consider what are the important areas. So I come back now toward what's been done with the World Energy Council as far as the UE particular focus. As you can see in the UE, pretty much everything that's really interesting to consider as far as the future of cities is packaged up, and not the uncertainties, but the clear priorities. When your country is 85, 90% urbanized, sustainable cities is a foregone conclusion. So smart and sustainable cities is already an action priority. There's no uncertainty about it. It has to happen as well as energy efficiency, renewable energy, and digitalization. So all the things that we focus on the most in this lower right-hand corner, not so uncertain, action priority, energy efficiency, digitalization, renewable energy, smart cities. That needs to happen. And so how do we go about doing that is very important. Right now, if you look at what McKinsey put out in 2018 as far as their overview of smart cities globally, you see Abu Dhabi and Dubai do pretty well, but most wealthy cities are doing fairly well. It's almost not quite linear, but you can see a linearity it is actually linear, linearity between wealth of the city and where it scores as far as deployment of smart city technologies. Abu Dhabi and Dubai, I'll circle those so you can see them. Dubai is actually pretty much on trend. Abu Dhabi has a little bit more room for improvement. And interestingly enough, given the context today, Dubai and Moscow scored identical as far as deployment of smart city technologies. But we see in the Middle East an opportunity to increase and improve, looking across, again, the utilities area, the healthcare areas, mobility areas, security, and government services. All those have to be looked at in those areas where technology is being deployed. So that's what our focus is trying to make really Abu Dhabi and Dubai as smart and sustainable as possible. And we do that at the Khalifa University. And so Khalifa University, interestingly enough, what Abu Dhabi or the UAE has done is all their major research universities 3 years ago were merged into one, with the idea being that we'd have one university in Abu Dhabi that could focus on all the key sectors. And so when I was appointed to be in charge of the research for the university, the question was create a map of all the areas that matter and then try to make them work together so they have a sort of an integrated, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts kind of way of operating. So what we did was we put together the clean energy, water environment, oil and gas. The country thrives on oil exports. You can imagine it's a huge part of the economy. Healthcare, and then aerospace. We could talk for endlessly about the number of things that the UAE is trying to do in its space sector and supply chain logistics. And the two platforms, the one is the more advanced forms of ICT, so cybersecurity, next generation networks like 5G and sensors, and then AI, robotics, and data science all in one area, and then advanced materials and manufacturing. What's interesting is the reason we did not create a vertical on smart city is because the idea was the smart city is essentially all this. So you have all these areas, you have platforms, you have verticals, but as we said, if you're looking at a city, you have mobility, you have waste, energy, water, healthcare, security, and government services. So you have to look at all this stuff together and you make a smart city. So we began moving ahead with this as a strategic roadmap, but then looking at very specific areas in which we can help the government, Abu Dhabi and Dubai in particular, move ahead in their initiatives through our R&D programs. And so we started picking off the prototype map, areas in which the government entities, agencies that we work with were ready to move ahead, in which we could help them. Now, we did this by creating 3 research institutes and 21 research centers within those different focus areas. So the Masdar Institute and Petroleum Institute are 2 institutes focused on energy, 1 oil and gas, 1 clean energy plus water and environment. And so we have a number of research centers there. When I have something in black, it means there's a sponsored either government agency or company funding the research. We have a 3rd institute, which is the Intelligence Systems and AI Institute, which was just launched this year. And so that has, again, all those areas of artificial intelligence, data science, robotics, ICT. We have other sectors which don't yet have an institute, but they have lots of activity as far as research centers. So healthcare, space, being outer space, plus to some extent aerospace terrestrially, and supply chain logistics, and then advanced materials and manufacturing. So I'll go through some of the ways in which we're prototyping the smart city concept through these centers without going through every single center individually. Just give you highlights of some of the more interesting things that we're doing in order to support the UAE. As we talk about prototypes, though, it's important to mention that what we do as university can't be done alone. So if you're familiar with this idea of technology readiness, what we're trying to do is take basic research to the point of commercial deployment of a technology. And so although we do have institutes and we have centers that can go up to very high levels of development, we can't build and commercialize the final product. So the way we've put it is Khalifa University, through the institutes and centers, will go from basic research, which is the TRL sort of 1, to the thought of where basic research can go in application, which is the TRL 2. Then we prototype in the laboratory, in the university, up to what we call TRL 3-4. And then typically a partner will start working with us to do development for commercialization, which we call the TRL 5-6 area. And then ultimately the partners deploy the technologies. Now that said, I'll give you 1 or 2 examples where we've actually built a full commercial deployable software, not necessarily what they call the deep technologies, which are hardware, but the software we have built fully and deployed that for some of the partners we have. So software is a little different, where we do the entire TRL spectrum, but usually it's a partnership required to translate. So as a first example, the energy. I think energy among the smart city areas in the UAE has always been one of the key issues. We've historically in the country, the power sector, at least in the UAE, has been gas-based. Natural gas, almost 100% in the power sector. Now, the country has a target to be 44% renewable energy by 2050. I'm on the Dubai Future Council for Energy, and so as a city, Dubai wants to be 75% renewable energy by 2050, and we're most likely now in this year going to up that target to probably 100% by 2050, which is very difficult. And so energy has become the big area for us to focus on. So the first center that we developed to support the smart cities area of the UAE was the Research Center for Renewable Energy Mapping Assessment. That was developed in 2012. And so the idea there is that you can use satellite data, the electromagnetic spectrum, which inherently doesn't have any meaning. But when you collect those information about what's happening in the atmosphere above a particular country, and you bring in other data from environmental variables and correlate that to measurements on the ground of, for instance, your solar resources, you can train a neural network to perfectly tell you what the solar energy is, all the components, the direct component, the horizontal, the diffuse component, the total component. And so in the country, it's very difficult. For many years, there was incorrect information about what the resource is in order to provide renewable energy to the cities, because we have so much dust and we have so much humidity in the country. Believe it or not, coastally, we have lots of humidity. And so when you have atmospheric aerosols, you scatter light. And so sometimes satellite data, if not corrected for this, can be very, very wrong in how your renewable energy is forecasted. So going back to 2008, the country first thought we'd do concentrated solar, and the measurements, the calculations using the data at that time were off by 15, 20%. The economics of the project were very bad. So we created the center and found a way to correct for all the atmospheric turbulence, dust, and humidity, and get the right measurements. So now, today, we can correctly predict what all the components of solar resource are, and we also have software which allows you to predict and understand the economics of any type of technology in a concentrated solar PV plant. So with that development, we further this year began working with the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment to build them the software which they've deployed, the software allowing them to understand solar energy resources, but also understand climate issues. So the reason it's the AI lab for climate monitoring and forecasting, using the same approach, getting satellite data, running it through a neural network correlated against ground measurements, you can start to understand what the concentrations of atmospheric aerosols are. So any type of nitrogen-based, sulfur-based, carbon-based atmospheric aerosol, dust, all that, you can start to predict the exact levels and give early warnings to people for health impacts, for instance. So now the center helps with the energy side of the cities and also the health side. If there's a very dusty day and people shouldn't be outdoors, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment can tell people, because they have a real-time early warning system, which is very visual, as you can see there. They have maps, they have colors, and these things. You have to be experts in artificial intelligence to utilize this. It's deployed. The second is a partnership, not necessarily, it's leveraging what we did in the UAE, but it's with Riyadh and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the biggest country in the Gulf, has the biggest power sector, and now, as of just probably a couple months ago, the highest ambitions for total amount of renewable energy deployed. Problem is in Riyadh, they don't necessarily know how they're going to dispatch all this renewable energy. If it's photovoltaic, it's intermittent, not available all the time, sun only shines during certain hours of the day. So they asked if there was a way we could help them build software so that they could manage the renewable energy better. And this blank box is actually a little movie that should be running in a loop, so it's not just a blank box. But the real-time system allowed them to predict renewable energy, so we call that the renewable energy mapping system, and dispatch it. Now this is more complicated because the system built not only has the forecast in renewable energy, but we also had to bring the Center for Advanced Power and Energy to help understand how the grid operates and also how the demand side is developing. So in any given day, you're going to have to predict what the demand for electricity is going to be, what the solar resource is going to be, or the energy resource you're trying to understand, particularly if it's intermittent, what the state of the electricity grid is, how congested it is, how it's operating. And if you have storage, how much storage you have available and what state of charge it's in. With all those information together, you feed those into, again, a more advanced artificial intelligence algorithm to help figure out what the dispatch could look like. So you're going to do your prediction and then your dispatch, the dispatch still being controlled by an individual. We don't do fully autonomous dispatch, but getting a more accurate measurement of how a city of Riyadh can run on renewable energy. And so this now has been deployed through KA-CARE in Saudi Arabia. It's one of the entities involved in the renewables for the Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, and they're now working with that. And that, again, is a picture of their control room where they run the software. And so these are the real, they're not real time, but it's a picture of what at some point in time was real time operation of the system. A new area, so international collaboration I thought was interesting for cities too. So energy is very important, but transportation and health are two other areas of cities where prototyping we picked out to be extraordinarily important. So with the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, KAIST, we've had for some time a large partnership. In April of 2019, we agreed to start a joint center that would focus on two areas of smart cities: smart transportation, smart health. Smart transportation, I thought, was particularly interesting because, as I said previously, transportation is an area that really needs to be upgraded in almost every city. In the UAE, we've seen continual need for more public transportation because people are always taking their cars everywhere. In Dubai, the idea was to bring electric buses. With this center, we wanted to help bring electric buses, which are autonomously operating, so that you don't have to have anyone driving the bus, of course, and then also wirelessly charging. Why wirelessly charging? And this is context again. In the UAE, if you try to operate a bus and it's working on a big battery, in the summertime when the temperature gets up to about 40, 45 degrees Celsius, people get in and out of the bus, you open and shut the door all the time, and the air conditioning runs at extraordinarily high level. And so what we found is when they put out a tender, all the Chinese bus manufacturers, global bus manufacturers, they can't build a bus that has a battery that stays charged long enough to run in the summertime. So we're having a lot of problems finding a way to have public transportation in the cities of Dubai and Abu Dhabi when you're running on electric transport mode. So the wireless charging is a potential solution. If you can charge wirelessly fast enough, you potentially could have the battery continually recharge on a bus route rather than having to stop and do hook up and do a charge that way. So this is something, there's a full demonstration in Korea at KAIST, and we're hoping to bring that technology to Abu Dhabi. I think it's quite interesting. And then smart healthcare, that's again the Internet of Things. We have lots of work in the UAE. Cardiovascular disease, amongst many other, diabetes is huge. Many people in the population are affected. So looking at Internet of Things, tracking people through wearables, trying to detect the onset of cardiovascular disease by looking at their biosignals, or if they have a cardiovascular disease, trying to help them manage that. This is now one of the projects we're doing on the AI platform of the smart healthcare. And then robotics. So as you saw, we have a robotics center, we have a healthcare engineering innovation center. The combined is working on robotics, and many of the times rehabilitation robotics. So with Korea, this is one of the centers on both health and transport. We're doing prototyping to help with those two components of the city. We have two centers which are the core of the AI and Intelligent Systems Institute, and I'll not go into great detail on both of them. I'll just mention I believe that the future of artificial intelligence, although it's a very broad word, making things seem more human-like in their operation, a lot of it boils down to the way you get data in large quantities, transmit that using next-generation networks like 5G, store that, and then use that in different architectures, which allow you to work seamlessly in different modes. So the Cyber Physical Systems Center is about, more so, not so much about the sensing per se, the communications, so how you deploy and utilize in the cities of Abu Dhabi and Dubai 5G networks. When you get to the end user, we're trying to build lightweight algorithms that can run artificial intelligence on the end device. So a lot of times now AI it's traditionally been run on the cloud. It's extraordinarily computationally intensive, energy intensive. If you want to bring that closer to the user, not have to shuttle data back and forth in order to run the algorithm, you'd like to have something low energy, lightweight, and a whole new architecture. So most of our AI architectural work is on what we call the end use, sort of the distributed users. So out there, not necessarily on the cloud, beyond what they call the fog of devices, directly on the point of the end use. And then there's cybersecurity. And again, I mentioned previously cybersecurity being a thread that runs through smart cities. How you make sure the data transmissions are secure and reliable when you're working with large amounts of data being transmitted. On robotics, the three areas that we're working on, one is the object detection or object recognition and tracking. So here it's not just individual systems. We have multiple tandem drones working on identifying people, places, things that we're trying to discover, and then being able to track them over time by communicating amongst each other, which is important because when you're moving throughout the city, you're trying to track things throughout the city. You're having individuals or objects, maybe a car, maybe the movement of shipping. Those are going to be moving throughout an environment which needs to have ongoing tracking. So cameras and or mobile robotics communication. I will go shortly. A very interesting problem for cities is safety in extreme environments. So I'll talk about how we use robotics in that context, and we're prototyping. And then industrial applications, more of the manufacturing context, but a big area in robotics now is having robots work together. If you'd seen on the slide, we have a center called the Aerospace Research Innovation Center. And so there we now have robots on the shop floor working with people. It's really the same thing as trying to prototype an autonomous vehicle, except you have a robot in a manufacturing environment walking around people, or not walking, but now it's moving around people, and how you keep it be able to be safe with people while doing its job. So we've done quite a bit in those industrial applications. The area that I'll talk about for cities, though, is for the safety side, because I've already talked about health, talked about transportation and energy. On safety, as cities grow, and what we're trying to see in the UAE is we're trying to densify the cities. So we don't want them to grow out and sprawl, we want them to grow up. And so we have very, very tall buildings. And if you're familiar, the world's tallest building is in Dubai. It's the Burj Khalifa. It's 828 meters. And so the problem that came up with Emaar Properties, which is behind the building, is if you have a fire and it's at 800 meters, how do you fight the fire? And so a hook and ladder truck, as you can see here, it's going to reach up to less than 100 meters. So it's a big problem. I'll not want to live on the top of an 800-meter building and not have someone be able to fight a fire if the building has some kind of emergency situation. So what we've done is we have a project on understanding how drones can help carry payloads up to 700 to 800 meters. And it's very difficult because you can imagine if you ever flew an airplane, if you watch the altitude, at 700 to 800 meters, you have a very different climate. So you have wind speeds to deal with, you have different temperatures, so the robot's going to go through an entirely different environment was trying to fight a fire at that level while carrying a fairly heavy payload. And so you imagine batteries today, how long a battery stays charged if a robot's trying to carry 100 kilograms, and how can the robot then also detect where it should be pointing a device to help fight a fire. So this project has been ongoing, and so Imar Properties created this because if we're going to keep building these super tall buildings in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, which we certainly are because that seems to be the way that the government likes to do things, Saudi Arabia too, who can build a taller building, we have to build the safety aspects. And so this is one area where I think robots are perfect. Anything which is the dull, dirty, dangerous, extreme environment, we're trying to build robotic systems, and that's very well tailored to the city context of the UAE. Finally, and it's sort of the last area I'll talk about is construction, because we said a lot about how cities operate, but it's not just the buildings operating in their heating, ventilation, lighting, and all this when they're built. It's how you build the cities. And I mentioned this massive amount of this massive amount of material being used in cities. How do you dematerialize and more efficiently and effectively build a city? There are multiple ways which you can use new technology to go about construction. And I won't go through all of them. I will just say in Dubai, they're probably checking a box. In Abu Dhabi, on almost all these components. By 2025, every government building is mandated to have 25% 3D printed within the building structure. So it won't be the whole building 3D printed, but 25% of it has to come from 3D printed components. Very interesting. What I will talk about, though, more so than that, is the materials area, because I think materials is one area that is sort of not looked at enough these days relative to digitalization. So I think digitalization is really important, extremely interesting, but materials is a very good opportunity. And so a couple years ago, actually I started on the project several years ago when Mubadala Development Corporation actually agreed with the University of Manchester to create a graphene engineering innovation center, which would focus on the development and commercialization of graphene-based products. So looking at sensors, membranes, composites, coatings, batteries, you name it, what can be created from graphene and other 2D materials. Graphene and 2D materials being one atom thick sheets of whatever the material may be. Graphene happens to be carbon with phenomenal properties. So with graphene, when it's one sheet thick, as you may have heard, 200 times stronger than steel, harder than diamond, extraordinarily light. So 1,000 times lighter than paper per unit area. Many interesting things with graphene. Then when you functionalize the graphene, say it's graphene oxide, you have chemistry which can be exploited, which gives you new opportunities. So what we've done, I'm on the board of the Graphene Engineering Innovation Center in Khalifa University as a research partner. We've been looking at how you can create new composites or composite materials that can be used in construction. And so as just one example, concrete. Most people are aware that concrete is a highly carbon intensive material. When you produce a ton of it, you produce typically 1 ton of CO2. Turns out, if you take graphene oxide and you add it into 0.05 weight percent, which is 1/2 of 0.1% by weight, you can increase the strength of the cement and then ultimately the concrete by about 40% as far as compressive and tensile force, and then flexurally, bendability, by about 60%. So it's a very, very, very small addition when it's uniformly dispersed can provide magnificent, enormous benefits to the material itself. When you do that in the cement, then the concrete, which is used in the construction, become much less carbon intensive because you just need less material. So we're able to now project that you could probably reduce by half the amount of carbon emissions from 1 ton of concrete by what you can do with the cement by adding graphene additives. And there's many other examples. So as I mentioned, coatings and all these types of different areas in buildings are now being looked at as opportunities in construction. So I think this is a great opportunity in the material space to complement digitalization and prototyping. And so cities will benefit quite a bit from that. I think it's an opportunity that we're going to continue to pursue. So now I'm coming to the conclusion, given that we've looked at some of these different examples, and again, trying to bring it back to context. The goal with all I've been talking about is, right now in the UAE, we call ourselves prosperous communities. So we have wealthy cities and their population is fairly low. Assuming that as cities grow, which we have growth in the Gulf, you want to have densification and wealth creation. You don't ever want to see a regression backwards. So no, red lines going in the upward, right arrows is where we need to go. I think the focus on trying to create smart and sustainable opportunities in the areas we talked about, so all the utilities, power, water, the waste is very important, but not to forget that we have mobility, we have healthcare, we have security, and then we also have government services. Those all have to be considered to try and move in this direction. What I think this diagram misses is another dimension for sustainability, which is the clean energy. And so clean energy not being just power, so renewable energy, but looking at how you bring energy efficiency to buildings on the efficiency side is extraordinarily important. Then how you power, whether it's transportation or buildings or industry, in a more clean way is very important. So you don't just want these cities to grow in the sort of to the upper right diagonal to create wealth as they densify and they grow in population. You ultimately would like to have the three dimensions, and so also create an upward trajectory toward more sustainability. So you have the smart city, the sustainable city, and ultimately no regression to what we call the urban decline, which is for us, in our context, that would be the concern. Is if the UE cities ever do start to lose some of the value they're currently creating, it would be a very big problem. So we're worried about trying to create more sustainability, maintaining the levels of wealth, and trying to improve the lives of people. And it's very interesting because the UAE has got now the initiatives to create the happiest cities on the planet, the most productive people. So there's a lot of things going on around trying to maintain this. But I think the prototyping idea, which is the context of the discussion, is very important because we certainly have not arrived at trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve in all different dimensions I talked about. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for your attention and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
So thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture. I'd like to invite Vicente for your view and your ideas on what has been said. Please.
So, thank you, Steven, for your presentation. In fact, I met you in 2011 in Masdar, because at that time, the city of the future, in fact, was Masdar. It was somehow, the interesting discussion is that Emirates doesn't have an urban tradition. Maybe only Dubai has an old settlement, but the other cities like Abu Dhabi or others, in fact, they didn't exist as a city 50 years ago. So that means that the idea of urbanity in this part of the territory somehow was invented. I think that this is one of the best samples of some countries that they know that their grandfathers were using camel, and maybe the grandchildren will be using camel again. And then they are the generation that they had the opportunity to have a lot of income coming from oil or from gas, and they are using them to urbanize themselves and to create the opportunity to develop other forms of economy. Because if your economy is only based on something that maybe in the future no one will be interested to buy, that is the oil and the gas. So that means that if you are using that money that you have in the moment in order to create to build the wealth for the future, I think that this is a great initiative. And then specifically in Abu Dhabi, another topic is that the word future cities didn't exist 25 years ago. When I was a student, we didn't talk about the future at all. It was in the 80s and in the 90s, and it was more about the moment of management of some kind of reality. In the urban planning, we were copying historical cities, so there was no any discussion about the future. But I think that the digital revolution accelerated the idea that the future was there, and we need to take some kind of decisions about that. So that means that there was this situation that, in fact, few cities, China started to grow very fast, but they were not very open. We didn't know very much what happened there. But on the contrary, in Abu Dhabi, they decided to launch a project, in that case developed with Foster and Partners, to build a city that was called Masdar. In fact, it's not exactly a city, it's a district with around 60,000 people, but you say you are making a city, it looks better, no? That to say that you are building a district near the airport, that this is what in fact is Masdar. But in any case, we were visiting that place. It was the first city that they were using self-driving cars, although it was in a controlled environment. But the truth is that they were right. 10 years later, everyone is working with the idea of the self-driving car as a real, I would say, a real industry that is going to happen soon. So So then that means that I would like to present my admiration for some of the work that they are doing in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. You know that this is a strange, well, not strange, but a special place. I come from a part of Europe where I would say democracy has been something fundamental in the last centuries, or let's say at least the last century. And then in that place, there is no democracy. But there is some other ways of thinking on the future. Because a city is an invention and is the representation of the political agreement that is behind of that. So I would say that in the same way in China, they don't have a democracy, but it's very clear that the leaders are pushing very strong in order to build a better condition for the people, no? So yeah, I would say my only, not concern, but it's very clear that the program that they are developing about the implementation of technology for the future, in the case of Abu Dhabi or Dubai, they are talking without any limit. I would say that the idea in Barcelona or many places in Europe, there are more moral limits on what we are talking, on what we are not talking about, because obviously there are some questions about the safety, about the property, about the data. For example, in many cities in California, they approve a law where you cannot look to the people using the cameras. You cannot use face recognition. While in China, this is what the government is doing everywhere to anyone. So that means that the discussion about the future of city and technology will be maybe framed in a discussion about the political use on the technology, because it's very clear that some countries, they will have some limits and some others, they will not. I think that in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the Emirates, that are in between, I would say, many situations, China, Russia, Europe, and America, they are in a good position to use experimentation in some very specific way. And I think that the kind of projects that they are doing, I think that they are great. They announced also, I don't know if this is under development, the use or the development of, for example, Hyperloop technology connecting Dubai and Abu Dhabi, that this is another, let's say, great challenge for the future of transportation, ground transportation. I would say that obviously in order to do such a research, you need to use a lot of resources. When I was working for the city of Barcelona, we have we say that the pilot projects were over, because you could be talking about pilot projects for forever, but then the question is that the revolution is here. We should bring pilots to reality. The question is not only to experiment in one place, that we need to do it, but to accelerate this implementation of the new ideas and the new technologies everywhere. Because if not, companies are experts on making pilots and selling pilots to cities that sometimes want to participate or to pay for that, but it's not clear how implementation is going to happen. I think that one of the biggest challenges, and that's why we are developing here a program called Prototyping Future Cities. What I discovered working in the city is that in the cities, no one knows about the technology, and in the companies, technological companies, no one knows anything about cities. So the biggest problem that we have is that there is a broken, let's say, language framework about what to do. When I talk about public space, companies are thinking in another idea. So that means that the companies always try to develop technologies for the sake of the business, and in the cities in general, they are trying to manage the city, but they are not pushing very hard for innovation. So I think that one of the biggest challenges for the future, and that's why, to have this conversation in the Higher School of Economics, that is a well-reputed international university, is this idea that we need to educate a new generation of experts, in the same way that we are talking about biotechnology. And when you are developing biotechnology, you don't have a doctor and a computer science, and they work together in order to make something. Now, they have education programs related with the biotechnology. And then we have doctors that they know about the computer science, and that's why we can progress on that. So I think that we need really to educate a new generation of people that will be able to understand how to run a city from the governance point of view, but also they will be able to understand what you have been talking about and how we can integrate radical technology with the daily basis governance of cities. No? So, but in any case, I think that the projects and the framework that you have been presented really is great.
Oh, sure. Those are very good points, and I agree with them. I think it's one of the areas that I was focusing on when I was putting the presentation together is this idea of city context. Every city is a different system, and so it makes it a challenge as when you go to your context and you figure out what makes sense. You have to look pretty deeply, because if you take the wrong view on where your city sits with regard to its political context, its economic context, its development context, the prototypes and the pilots, which you would be sold, as you mentioned, by companies, and they can be looked at and they can be experimented with, but the ultimate value creation you'll get from them is minimal. I've seen you mentioned Mustar, and so the reason that's interesting. Mustar started off as a concept in 2008 is being a test bed for new technology, and so it was going to be the $20 billion city, fully developed, 6 square kilometers by 2015. It was very big announcements and very flashy, fancy videos. And that was exactly the point about what you don't want to do, because what ended up happening was a lot of demonstrations of different technologies from different consultants without really a clear purpose, and without really a clear vision for how the system in the small scale city would evolve to become bigger and have deployment in Abu Dhabi and then perhaps in Dubai, across the UAE. And so what happened with the Mustar, the city kind of took steps around. We had some transportation. We had a company called To Get There, and they had this nice little car that would go on a track. It was magnetically guided, so it looked all like it was autonomous, but really was going on a track. And then the buildings, they were sustainable for sure, but there weren't very many of them, and they were very expensive. And if you'd taken the technology available in 2008 and deployed it into a full city, you would have the world's greatest museum. I think you'd all want to visit it, because you can imagine what's happened in the past 10 years as far as technology. So that was the wrong view, I think, of how to take and build a city. What happened with Mustar, eventually the master plan was rethought, and so over the period of more like 20 years, it was agreed different districts would build out in a more thoughtful way, different demonstrations of different technologies which are state-of-the-art in a given year based on the need would be tested, piloted. If they worked, we go a little further with those. And so now the city's growing much better. So if you go to Mustar City relative to 2008, you would see that it looks like a city. There's more happening there. There's the Mustar Institute. So Khalif University's got 3 campuses. So our Mustar Research Institute is in Mustar City doing clean energy and water. But you've also got some hotels. International Renewable Energy Agency has its headquarters there. There's now a shopping mall, and there is fully autonomous transportation. So Navia, if you've ever been riding on one of their autonomous vehicles, they have some deployments around the world that are kind of nice. They have a system that works in a more structured environment. So it's like a level 4 type of autonomy. So it's not full open road autonomy, but it's a shuttle which goes between different parts of the city, and it's being demonstrated and tested, and it runs on camera and LiDAR systems like any autonomous vehicle being tested today. And so that's now deployed, and it's something that potentially could be scaled up in a very controlled environment and used elsewhere in Abu Dhabi. Dubai is doing something similar, very controlled environment, vehicles that run autonomously, but they're not really around that many pedestrians. They're not in a very dynamic environment. So that's being tested in a more thoughtful way. And then the city and the goals of it are much more realistic, as far as it will be largely powered on sustainable energy. It can't be zero carbon, at least not in the near term. Maybe in the next several decades, cities could evolve, become more towards zero carbon if there's some kind of negative emissions approaches. But all those kind of announcements and ideas from that big bang were rolled back, which I think has allowed us to think more thoughtfully about how cities can be prototyped and developed for value. And then throughout the region, Abu Dhabi itself, as we said, Mustar is more of like a town. It's a small part of a bigger city. And so I think the other paradigm of the UE, which is interesting, which I've considered, it came up in a construction event I was speaking at a few weeks ago, probably many cities, it won't be one city. So if you define a city as thousands or tens of thousands of people, you have cities within what's called a city. And so, it's just the reality, when you have the legacies, they're going to develop in their own way. So we have sustainable cities all over the UAE now. We have small residential environment. It's got, essentially it's working on full renewable energy, most sustainable buildings, highly sustainable transportation, but it's like a Masdar, much smaller than that. It's like maybe 10,000 people. If those pop up, then you have to figure out how to build a system where you sustainably and intelligently connect the components of the bigger city through these smaller towns or baby cities. And maybe it's the transportation network that becomes important. So you mentioned Hyperloop. And so as again, come back to my transportation idea, if you start to prototype and pilot cities to be used in cities, you have the micromobility, which we have very poor in the UAE. No one walks, no one bikes. Well, you potentially could in the winter, but the climate makes it very difficult to get around without a car. So you go more toward that intermediate mobility where you have a car, maybe ride sharing, ride hailing, these kind of things. And then between the cities, say 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, now the idea being like have a Hyperloop. We already have Uber helicopter. And so aerial transportation within the city, we have the quadcopters, so the vertical takeoff and landing pilots. So I think the transportation issue to connect mini cities within the bigger city may be something evolves out of the prototyping initiative like Masdar and what we've learned from that.
So thank you. We have some few minutes for questions and answers, please. Okay, so then I have a question myself, if possible.
She had a question.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. So I really like the concept that you've been explaining about coming from the prototypes to the building idea and to the city idea, because this is the concept that we try to follow inside of the master program together with Vicente in our laboratory for experimental urban design, which is just in the opposite building. And the challenge that we're facing while we are communicating with different city halls, like recently we've been in Copenhagen and communicating with different laboratories and architects and planners inside of a city, but not only there, in Moscow as well, is that all those like technological guys and urban planning guys, this is just the same that what Vicente was explaining, they are on a different level of understanding what city needs, and actually those systems are not quite very well connected, right? So we're having those prototypes, which are kind of a mix of electronics and technologies. Then we're having the building, which adds also the architecture level, and then we're having this urban system, which is something overall connected. And this is quite clear how to plan it in a new cities and in a fast developing cities, because you build the infrastructure from zero and you have this opportunity to implement those new regulations, new rules inside of a physical context of the city, right? But when you are working in historical cities like Moscow, for example, or many other cities in Europe and also in Asia, you have this like context of physical infrastructures that have been built, and that's why those systems like more difficult to introduce. So how do you think for those cities which have these already planned and like strong infrastructures, but historical ones that for sure need to be renewed, refreshed in the modern conditions and in a new agenda of technological innovations. So if they have this opportunity to be faster than those cities that are built from zero, from scratch, let's say, and which is this gap between those new cities and the old cities, and how maybe it can be overcome? So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, it's the question of what's the green field and brown field. So if you can do something completely new versus dealing within a context which is fairly well established and you have to work around what infrastructure is there and isn't going to go away for a long time. You know, these buildings, they last for many, many decades, and so they're not going to tear them down and build something new because you want to create a smart city. I think the way to do it is if you take the context of, let's say, Moscow or any of the cities which are already established, you can do quite a bit without going through, you know, an entire urban planning exercise and changing the way in which things have set up. I mean, obviously, incremental growth can be done in a more, I think, thoughtful way, you know, trying to create compaction and trying to create efficiency in the growth of the city. But I think with the current city, the intelligence behind things like traffic management. So on the streets today, to the extent that you can understand traffic flows and you can model the traffic flows and you can find ways to improve the traffic flows, it's something you couldn't really do a decade ago because the computing power, the data collection, the ability to communicate, as we said about the deployments like 5G, real time, seamlessly, quickly, all that's now a new technological platform which is there, which can improve a city from, say, a transportation perspective. So even without changing the paradigm or with what you have as far as your urban planning, or because you have a context, you can do a lot to improve the efficiency and the way things operate through the intelligence of the city, for instance. I think in the buildings themselves, likewise, the systems, to the extent that they can be more responsive, more adaptive to the user in the building, try and look at the multiple dimensions. I didn't get into it in detail, but something we looked a lot at, because Dubai is trying to be the happiest city, is a building right now, the energy profile, okay, people care about it, but it really doesn't matter that much relative to the value of the real estate and the value of the people. So how do you optimize the environment through intelligent systems of how the building is able to provide thermal comfort, ambient noise reduction, ventilation, airflows, lighting? Retrofits can go a long way toward making a more intelligent, productive environment for the people in the built environment. And then, of course, the power, when it comes to clean energy, depending on the city, and I think in many contexts, you can't do a whole lot with putting within the city rooftop distributed renewables because it may not work so well. It's working with the utilities which connect to the city. And so if you want to be a 100% clean energy-based city, then you have to figure out what makes sense for your context. In Dubai, they want all the buildings to have rooftop photovoltaic, and they want the Water Electricity Authority to providing a large amount of its power from renewables. That's why with Riyadh and Dubai, we're looking at how to build these systems which can bring in the intermittency, because the utility has to be the partner with the city in order to make that work. So I think if you go through examples of trying to work around what is in place with current city environment, you can go a fairly long way toward improving. I mentioned that slide on 10 to 30% of most of the things that matter to people in cities being able to improve upon by implementing smart technology. I think if you look at all the use cases, you can go a long way. It came up in the Dubai context a few weeks ago, since we have Expo 2020, and we have what's called it's a Dubai 2020, which will be the permanent city from where Expo is happening. It's perfectly planned. Siemens is building all the infrastructure, 75% smart buildings. It's bottom up, completely thought about, transportation, everything. Someone said, why can't it all be like this? And it can't, because it's now being built for 2020 for a purpose. And so it will be the perfect picture of a sustainable smart city because someone hired a company and they're doing it in every way they can think of that's going to make it look like the right way to do a sustainable smart city. I think in that context, you have to take the current city infrastructure, make it as smart and sustainable as possible, and then through the connectivity, which will typically be transportation modes, find ways to bring this new micro city into the bigger city context and make it work together. I think it's a complex system problem. And the current cities, you're right, you're not going to tear up the roads and tear down the buildings, but you can make them work as efficiently as possible and connect those to the growth. And if the growth is up versus out, you have obviously densification, which is good, but if it's somewhat out, then how you connect these areas is quite important. But it's tough. I mean, I agree. We have, now Dubai has created future councils. So now we have future councils. And so the future councils, the prime minister has created, I'm on the Energy Future Council. We have transportation, we have security, AI, because they're now worried, what do we do for the next 50 years? So now 2071, the country will be 50 years old in 2021. We have to create a 50-year plan for how everything will be evolving for 50 years, because the concern is, to your point, things are here, and we're not going to tear them down or get rid of them, but the new things need to come, the growth needs to come, so how do you plan all the sectors to do that? So it is tough, but I think the government coordination intelligently needs to happen, and the companies then need to factor into that. Companies should follow and not lead the technologies that get deployed.
I wanted to ask about the future of cars in the cities. Looking forward 20 or 30 years, how do you think will the cars still be the prior way of transporting the majority of people in the cities, or they will become a means of public transportation? So that's two parts of the question. So will they exist in a period of 20 or 30 years? And will they still be private or become public transport?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think the ideal would try to be moving people more toward public transportation because regardless of the whole move toward autonomous transportation, what have you, the more that people can not have private ownership of their vehicle, less vehicles, in theory, you'll have on the road, which would help with even congestion as much as or more so than the whole area of energy consumption, sustainability, greenhouse gas emissions and the like from combusting fossil fuels. And again, it's context dependent. If you have a city which has grown up and inherited the thought that there's going to be lots of private transportation, like Dubai or these cities which are more sprawling, it's going to be very hard in a very short time to get people on public transportation. Cities which are very, very compact, very dense, where there's not already a very high per capita number of vehicles, I mean, it's a great opportunity to try to develop public transportation as those cities move toward becoming more affluent if they're trying to increase their wealth and they're trying to increase their intelligence, so to speak, in the city. The notion of whether or not the cars will be operated by individuals or be operated autonomously, I think to some extent, if things move in the way that autonomous transportation happens, then it would definitely promote less private ownership to some extent. Because if you think about the car, the ride-hailing service and the like, I mean, their entire business depends on trying to remove the person from the vehicle. So if there is the opportunity for ride-hailing, taxi type of services to be operating independently, and it's convenient, it's efficient, it's fast, you can get where you need as quickly as possible, I think that would be an opportunity for more public modes of transportation to take effect. But it's going to be dependent on what the city is, how the context is set up, and how the urban layout happens. Because it's moving from one state to another always has an inertia. And so I think whether or not individual car ownership goes away or people move to public transportation will somewhat depend on where the city is starting from.
Okay, so probably the last question, yes, by you.
Yeah, my name is Dmitry. My name is Dmitry. I wanted to thank you for the presentation, and my question will be quite simple. Like in your speech, you mentioned a lot of great technologies. I mean, AI, drones, robotics, and so on. But I didn't see the two technologies I'm interested in is IoT and blockchain. And while IoT is well considered by many experts to be an integral part of smart cities of the future, does that mean that Khalifa University so far has no projects regarding IoT development? And as for blockchain, what is your opinion? What do you think, or can it find implementation in smart cities of the future? Thank you.
Good question. So the cyber-physical systems is sort of it means IoT to some extent. So when it comes to the platforms, the connecting the data through advanced networks, say 5G, to wherever the storage is for analytics, and this is edge analytics we're talking about, so not the cloud, but the edge, and then cybersecurity. That's all the IoT concept. Now, the blockchain part, we do have people work on blockchain. In fact, Dubai is probably I think, maybe the most advanced as far as the ambition for blockchain, because by 2021, Dubai intends to be fully paperless. And so there will be no paper transactions in Dubai in 2021. By 2020, they want the entire government to run on blockchain. So everything will be recorded on a blockchain. Now, how the blockchain, it's not going to be the same blockchain you see for Bitcoin, of course. It's going to be a much different proposition. But all the transactions will be recorded in a secure environment, distributed. It'll be a shared, more closed blockchain, so it won't be the sort of this anyone can participate in it. But everything will be done in that way. And so there's now a blockchain council in Dubai that's been set up, and it's become the locus in that city of where blockchain discussion is happening. So I think blockchain is very good. Some people think it doesn't, it's a lot of hype without a lot of substance. I think it had value for certain use cases. Unfortunately, cryptocurrencies have caused a lot of negativity toward blockchain. But the blockchain for supply chain, logistics, all those types of things, transaction and government services. ADNOC, the national oil company, has a pilot going on supply chain blockchain. So that's been going. And so in the energy sector, blockchain is happening. So I think blockchain is very interesting. We do have one of the centers I didn't talk about, there's a digital supply chain center. So they're looking at now use of blockchain for supply chain purposes. It's a little hard to figure, if you're trying to really push the boundary of R&D, where R&D in blockchain happens versus where you pilot the currently available technologies, because the Ethereum platforms and these types of things, you don't want to reinvent those. And so you're trying more to think about pilots deployments, prototypes of how you can utilize this well. And that's happening at the government level already. And so that's beyond the research stage, and that's happening in what they're calling a smart Dubai. Abu Dhabi is a little less oriented at the moment toward blockchain, but I think it'll take up eventually. It's great for government. I think, when we talk about those different areas, government services really need to try to pick up on the blockchain more, because it's a way to cut out a lot of intermediation, a lot of waste, make things more efficient. And, if that works well, I think the city can be very much more efficient in its operation. Sure.
So, one more question.
Hi, Pablo from Mexico, also from the master. So, to continue with this tension between all the new cities, but also we could say poor and rich cities in a larger global context, or developed and not developed cities, I would like to ask you how this smart city paradox you are promoting would communicate with these kind of other cities which are not becoming smarter, like how this gap is affecting on smart cities and on the other cities, the communication allowing, and also the capacity of updating from this, maybe a non-developed city try to become smart in the 4G, but then when the 5G comes, will not get to that point. So how this gap between these two worlds could you speculate on that?
Yeah, it's a very tough question. It comes up in almost so I work a lot with artificial intelligence. It comes up all the time because I'm on this global governance of artificial intelligence group that meets every year in Dubai. And the same thing is, there'll be haves and have-not countries. Some are moving very quickly ahead with intelligence in their cities, utilization of AI, deploying very quickly. Other countries, which are not financially well off, how do they afford the prototyping? How do they figure out how to create the infrastructure and build the infrastructure? And I don't really have a good answer to it. I mean, if you look in Africa, for instance, these countries that we say are urbanizing, they're not very wealthy countries. They require lots of financial aid in order to meet their basic infrastructural needs. One of the risks, I think, which has popped up, at least in the notion of artificial intelligence, is, and I have nothing against, I would do quite a bit with China, and we have an AI lab with Alibaba. But you look at a country like China, and they have the Belt and Road Initiative, and I've worked with them on what they're doing there. And you go to a country like Africa, for instance, they have huge infrastructure needs, they have huge resources. You offer your technology, but you also take the resources in exchange. Will that create some kind of opportunity, but also negative consequence for countries that have to rely on outside support, where there's dependency created? That could happen. To some extent, you do see that happening in certain cases, and particularly, if you are not familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative of China, it's an interesting thing to look at. Countries that are wealthy and can provide aid and support to others in exchange for helping them develop could be a geopolitical situation that arises. And I think that's one of the challenges to be considered politically about intelligent, smart cities in all areas of technology. Those that are able to move ahead quickly and utilize and deploy and have funding and financing and wealth, they'll take advantage of it, and that may be the way things evolve. And so, if you don't have such support, I don't know how a very, very poor city, without its own government finances to develop and build new technology, will move ahead very quickly.
I mean, because even as the paper thing you were saying from Dubai, the risk is that Dubai gets isolated from the rest of the countries that we use paper. Like, if we all communicate through letters and we cannot send one to Dubai, you will...
Well, I didn't catch the question. You were asking about developing countries, but the communication part, what's the question, the communication part?
Yeah, like at some point, maybe smart cities will become incapable of dialoguing with non-smart cities.
You mean the communication protocols become disconnected?
There's some tension there.
I don't necessarily see that happen. I mean, the speed at which communication happens is changing. The protocols that underlie the backbone of communication networks, I don't have an insider view that there'll be any particular disconnect of countries that don't adapt protocols that are universally adopted. 5G is fast, it's efficient, it's high data rate, but whether or not, I've not seen any potential issues about those that adopt 5G being disconnected from those that don't. I mean, because a lot of the wireless within the city then still goes quite a bit on backbones that run on land-based communication infrastructure. So I don't know. Maybe I've not seen it, so it's not something that would be isn't a problem, at least in my mind at the moment.
Thanks.
So, unfortunately, the time comes to an end, but I hope very much. So, first of all, I would like to thank, of course, Professor Griffitt for this very inspiring lecture, and also like to thank Professor Guyaart for his contribution. I'm pretty sure it is not the last time we receive Stephen at the Higher School of Economics, so we really would like to discuss the opportunities for collaborating with the Khalifa University. And in this connection, probably we'll have more frequent opportunities to meet. So thank you very much.
Thank you.